Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. George James Giles was born on the 5th of November 1884 in Ballarat, Eastern Victoria. He was the son of George James Giles Sr. and Elizabeth Mary Ann Sharp. Not much is known of his formative years or where he had any schooling, but what is known is that as an adult, he worked on the Victorian railways, reaching the position of ganger, and he married Hannah May Heathcote in Victoria in 1907. They would go on to have 2 children. By 1915, however, Giles and Hannah appear to have separated on accounts that he was allegedly an abusive alcoholic. These are claims that he denied, though it would appear that he also fathered an illegitimate child in 1916 with another woman that he had been cohabitating with since 1912. However, when he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force on the 1st of August 1916 at the age of 33, his paperwork bears the name George Smith, and lists the mother of his illegitimate child, Hilda Elizabeth Smith, as the initial next of kin when he signed his papers on the 16th of May 1916. It wouldn't be until the following January that he would amend his record to have his proper name and his legal wife as his next of kin listed. He'd be allocated to the 10th Reinforcements of the 29th Infantry Battalion, and after his initial training in Ascot Vale, he departed for overseas service aboard the troop ship HMAT Port Melbourne on the 21st of October 1916, arriving in England on the 28th of December 1916, arriving in France the following April, where he would be formally taken on strength with the 29th Battalion while it was in camp. Giles and the 29th Battalion would rotate between training camps, predominantly around the Pozières region of France, for the next 3 months. This also included occupying positions held by Sergeant David Twining when he repelled German counterattacks 9 months prior, as mentioned in episode 4, about the life, service and legacy of the Scout of Orleans. This period also saw a brief rotation to the frontline trenches around Langencourt-Marcel, which were, by the accounts of the battalion's official unit history, a particularly quiet stretch of the front, which made it perfect to give Giles his first introduction to trench warfare. It should be noted that there is a prevailing misconception perpetuated by Hollywood that during the First World War, soldiers spent their entire time in the front lines, when in reality, unless actively engaged in an offensive, they only spent on average 8 days in the front line trenches, followed by another 4 days in reserve trenches and then another 4 in rest and relocation areas. And while the 29th Battalion as a whole spent 18 days in the front line during this 3-month period, it rotated its 4 companies with 2 in the front and 2 in reserve or in support positions. In June, the 29th would relocate to Senlis to the south, and it would be here that Giles would go absent without leave for 2 days, presumably to travel to Paris, roughly an hour away, and in response he'd be fined 2 days' pay. At the end of July, the battalion would relocate closer to Belgium in preparation for the Battle of Polygon Wood, the same battle that John Hines participated in and his famous photo was taken, as mentioned in episode 2. Giles, however, did not participate, as he would fall ill with influenza and would spend the next 4 months in hospital. Finally rejoining the unit on the 26th of October as they rested in camp at Ouderdon, west of Ypres, as it replenished its losses following the capture of Polygon Wood. On the 15th of November, the battalion was once again in the front lines in support of operations near Vulvergem, mainly preparing defensive positions and transporting duckboards to shore up the front line, before they spent the end of the month in positions near Garpard, where it became under attack under heavy German shelling. Giles would once again return to hospital in December with influenza, and this time his condition was so severe that he'd be evacuated to England to convalesce. Following the capitulation of Russia with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany briefly gained a temporary manpower advantage over the Allies, and a very small window in which to exploit it, as the United States of America, which had joined the war in 1917, was close to being able to fully deploy its resources. When campaign conditions improved in the spring, German Quartermaster General Erich von Ludendorff launched a series of attacks with the intent of smashing through the Allied lines, outflanking the British forces to the north, and defeat the British Expeditionary Force. That would hopefully encourage France to seek an armistice. While we have the advantage of hindsight in 2021, in 1918, particularly in March, there was no guarantee that the war was going to end in November, and there was still possibility that Germany, had the spring offensive succeeded, could have actually come out on top. However, even after initial successes, including the near destruction of the British Fifth Army, which bore the brunt of the German offensive, Issues with logistics and increasingly stiff Allied resistance, as fresh Dominion troops were fed into the trenches to defend key locations like railway hubs, supply caches, and the like, meant that by the time that Giles had recovered and returned to his unit in April, most of the gains that Germany had taken during this offensive had either already been retaken or were in the process of being taken. One of the reasons for the sudden reversal was due in part to the lack of fortifications, and for the most part, the trenches in this area were non-continuous. It also took place on land that hadn't experienced 4 years of continual artillery bombardment, which meant an end to static warfare and a return to a more fluid style of combat. For the 29th Battalion, its first introduction to this kind of fighting would be during operations around Moulinscourt, a village that had been captured by the Australian 3rd Division in March, lost to the Germans during the Spring Offensive, only to be recaptured by the Australian 2nd Division on the 10th of June. On the 29th of July, the 29th Battalion, along with the rest of the Australian 5th Division, would commence limited offensive operations around Beacon Hill, utilising a tactic known as peaceful penetration. Peaceful penetration was the name for a tactic developed by Australian forces that combined the strategies of offensive patrols and trench raids. While offensive operations were restricted to the division level and above, it was the expectation of a battalion commander to conduct trench raids and patrols to make contact with the enemy and to collect intelligence when provided, and could do so without major oversight by brigade or divisional commanders. What battalion commanders could also do was alter the section of the front they were defending, to either extend the line forward to make use of an opportunistic terrain feature, or to constrict the line if an outpost or salient became too exposed. This leeway was exploited by Australian forces during this time. Because of the lack of fortifications, Australian patrols discovered that they could infiltrate German outpost lines and take them with minimal force. While a patrol or raid would then end with the operation with the forces returning to friendly lines with any prisoners or intelligence they had gathered, Australian troops would hold the outpost and then move their own line forward to quickly occupy German positions with minimal resistance. The impact on the German morale was immediate and pronounced, as quoted by the Chief of Staff of the German Second Army, quote, "During the last few days, the Australians have succeeded in penetrating or taking prisoner single posts or pickets. They have gradually, sometimes even in daylight, succeeded in getting possession of a majority of the forward zone of a whole division. Troops must fight. They must not give way at every opportunity and seek to avoid fighting. The best way to make the enemy more careful in his attempt to drive us bit by bit out of the outpost line and is to do active reconnaissance. If the enemy can succeed in scoring a success without any special support by artillery or assistance by special troops, we must be in a position to do the same." Unquote. This was also supported by General Herbert Plumer, commander of the British Second Army. Quote, "At the same time, I would like to tell you that there is no division, certainly in my army, perhaps in the whole British Army, which has done more to destroy the morale of the enemy than the 1st Australian Division." Unquote. After the first implementation of this strategy on the 5th of April 1918, it was widely used by the entire Australian Corps, to the point where some battalions were actively competing with each other to see how many prisoners or outposts they could take during a set period of time. While it was begrudgingly allowed by the Allied generals, it did cause more than a few headaches for planners, with orders routinely being given to take an objective, only to find that it had already been captured by the peaceful penetration. At Moulinscourt, the peaceful penetration operation resulted in the capture of 2 lines of German trenches, 128 prisoners, and 38 machine guns. This operation was criticised as unnecessary by senior British officers, as it diverted resources away that were being planned for the upcoming Allied counterattack. Following the Battle of Moulinscourt, Giles was marching back down into the valley of the River Ancre when he and another soldier, Private John Wallace Anderson of the 32nd Battalion, were ordered to present themselves to the 8th Brigade headquarters, some 4 miles away, through muddy communication trenches. It is said that when Giles arrived, he was in a foul mood and was, quote, expressing himself in true Australian style, unquote. Unfortunately, what he said was not recorded. Now, when the 2 soldiers arrived, the story for a long time was that they were greeted by Charles Bean, the Australian official war correspondent, historian, and later founder of the Australian War Memorial, and that he asked both soldiers for their uniforms and equipment, and this narrative had been accepted quite readily for over 100 years. However, Bean's own diaries at the time having been in a completely different section of the front at this time, and the request to Giles and Anderson was actually given by Brigadier General Edwin Tivey, who told them that he was going to make them famous. Make of that what you will. He was acting on a request from the Australian War Records section to collect sets of uniforms and equipment taken from men immediately after a raid. Before either man knew what was going on, they were taken outside to be photographed, both front and rear, then handed their uniforms, kits, and rifles over to the Deputy Assistant Director of Ordnance Services, who issued them with fresh equipment and handed their battle-worn gear to the Australian War Records section for safekeeping and transit back to Australia. So complete was this collection that Giles's tobacco, cigarette butts, and eating utensils that he apparently kept in his putties were taken and stored along with everything else. This one act would immediately result in one of the most known and iconic objects in the collection of the Australian War Memorial, as Giles's uniform would go on display almost continuously for over 80 years, still bearing the mud and detritus of that battle. The war for Giles, however, would go on beyond this chance encounter. In August, he would participate in the 8th Brigade's advance of the treacherous Morcourt Valley offensive, eventually capturing Valviers in the 9th of August. In this action, he would receive the military medal. The citation read, quote, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty during operations near Valviers, east of Villers-Bretonneux, on the 9th of August 1918, during the work of consolidating, several of his comrades, was covering the working party, were wounded by snipers, who were operating from concealed positions at very close range. Private Giles, though not a stretcher-bearer, and in spite of the fact that he was exhausted, went forward and succeeded in dressing the wounds of his comrades. He organised stretcher parties and personally assisted to remove the wounded to a place of safety. By doing so, he undoubtedly saved the lives of several men. Throughout the whole operation, he displayed great courage and coolness under the most trying conditions. By his personal efforts, he did much to ensure the success of his platoon," unquote. In late September 1918, the 29th Battalion would fight its last battle, serving alongside the United States 30th Infantry Division in breaching the Hindenburg Line at the Battle of the St. Quentin Canal Tunnel. Following this, and due to the casualties sustained to the Australian Corps, the decision had been made to disband one battalion in 4 to reinforce the remaining 3. The 29th was chosen to be one of those disbanded battalions, and Giles would join the 32nd Battalion on the 12th of October. By this point, however, the battalion was little more than half its authorised strength of 1,000 men. At this point, the entirety of the Australian Corps had been withdrawn from the line to rest and retrain for the expected renewed offensives of 1919, and thus did not participate in any further campaigning. Giles would return to England in April 1919, and then on to Melbourne aboard the HMAT Orita on the 29th of June that year. He would be formally discharged in September. It would seem that his return to Australia was not a joyous reunion to Hannah May, as she would file for divorce on grounds of desertion and misconduct. While he would remarry and resume his pre-war career on the railways, he would later work at a bakery, but would be unemployed during the Great Depression. In 1936, he unsuccessfully applied to the Repatriation Commission for a disability pension, stating that he'd been declared fit for service upon enlistment, and that the rheumatism and neurosis he suffered, likely factors in his struggle with unemployment, were a result of his war service. Quote, "I hope you are able to help in this matter," unquote, he wrote. Quote, "as I am just about desperate and destitute," unquote. His claim was, unfortunately, rejected. His ailments were deemed by medical officers to be, quote, "not due to war service," unquote. His health would continue to decline, and he would pass away on the 1st of July 1942 from a heart condition, aged 58. He was buried at the Cheltenham Memorial Cemetery in Victoria. He would be commemorated at the Moreland State School No. 2378 Honour Roll and the West Coburg Methodist Church Honour Roll. Sadly, despite assurances by Brigadier Tivey, Giles never saw the fame that his uniform received, as it wasn't until the 80s that his uniform, which had been on display for 60 years at this point, was finally attributed to him. The story is even worse for Anderton, as his whole uniform would disappear when it arrived in Australia. These days, Giles' uniform, along with the photos taken of him, sit proudly in the 1918 section of the Australian War Memorial's First World War Gallery in Canberra. In 2013, when the Australian War Memorial renovated its First World War Gallery for the centenary of the First World War, one of the visitors who saw Giles' uniform was his grandson, Graham Bremen. And while he never saw fame for the service he did, he remains part of the lasting legacy of Australian service and sacrifice, and for that, we thank him. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job Australia's Military History Podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Gangdangara people whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This episode was written, researched, produced, directed, and audio engineered by me, Ross, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. If you do know someone whose story needs to be told, feel free to leave a comment on an episode or send us an email at iwasonlydoingmyjobpod@gmail.com. If you like what we do here and you want to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is share this with a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, as it really helps others find the show. And if you want to join in on the conversation, join us over on Discord. And if you want more content, including show notes, photos, transcripts, and my various adventures finding memorials dotted around Australia, head over to our website at www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on all our social media pages at IWODMJ. Don't worry, there are links to everything in the show notes. Join me personally for more bite-sized history over on TikTok and pretty much everywhere else at Doc Winters. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not reflect the views or opinions of any entity, agency, or organization. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time. Bye.